Why not? Okay, so hello, I am David Sloan Wilson. I am the president of Pro-Social World, and so happy to introduce Jeremy Lent. We only met a few months ago at a gathering of futurists in Austin called Emerge. And I was somewhat familiar with your work, Jeremy, before then, and now I've learned more, and I greatly admire it. You are a public intellectual, as we've been discussing, and I think that I have a great admiration for public intellectuals. And so basically, you even spent a time in the business world before going on this odyssey. Two great books to your The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And George Monbiot describes you as one of the greatest thinkers of our age. And then the patterning instinct, a cultural history of humanity's search for meaning. And from my standpoint, this very much dovetails with the idea of dual inheritance theory, with the idea of our meaning systems as the cultural equivalent of our genes. And so there's a lot of common ground here that we'll be exploring. I'll finish up by saying that this is part of a weekly series. And the next week in the series is somebody else who is at the Emerge gathering, Farananda Ibarra, who is very much involved in the world of blockchains. And so basically regenerative holistic economies is part of what she'll be talking about. All of this will be up on our website, on our online magazine, This View of Life. That's how Darwin ended the origin of species, by saying there is grandeur in this view of life. And so that's why that's the title of our magazine. And so the format here is that Jeremy will be giving a standard length talk. There'll be a Q&A, and typically we have a general Q&A, and then that's followed by a 30-minute extended discussion with a group of people that have read material and discussed it beforehand. In this case, because this came together at somewhat short notice, we're just going to have one big, long, extended discussion after the Q&A. Everyone's welcome to stay for it, and I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about. And so with that, I think, Jeremy, please take it away.
All right. Well, thanks so much for that introduction, David. It's a real special, exciting opportunity for me to share this thinking with your group and for us to explore these kind of potentials for collaboration in the future. So to begin with, let me share the screen and take you through the sort of more formal part of this presentation, as we said. So let me click on share screen, and hopefully everyone can see it right there. And so what we're going to be talking about today is identifying the principles of an ecological civilization. And as I go into this, a reasonable question somebody might ask is, well, why do we need some sort of ecological civilization, like some sort of different kind of civilization? Can't we sort of like fix things within our current civilization? So I want to begin to scope out the reason for this need. And then we're going to be spending most of our focus on these underlying principles today, because a lot of them link to so much of the work that David himself has been working on in all these years. And so that's, I think, an exciting opportunity we have today around that. So hold on one second. And my screen share, I think, just went funky for a moment. And let me begin then by looking at why it is that we do need to consider this shift to a true different civilization. I'd like to begin basically by kind of zooming out and looking at the Earth, this beautiful planet in the middle of space, the only place we know of in the universe right now where life exists. And here in this beautiful little spot in the universe, life arose billions of years ago. And it's only been really the last couple of 100,000 years that a particular species developed the ability to actually impact consciously or unconsciously the actual very structure of life itself on this planet, which of course is the human species. And a reasonable question is, well, how have we been doing with this incredible power, this collective cultural power that we have? And the terrible answer is, we all know in this group right here, is we've been doing a terrible job. We're all only too familiar right now with these harbingers of a daunting future around the world, like the wildfires and the floods and the droughts that are so terrifying already, and we know are only going to be getting worse and worse. And of course, everyone in this group is familiar with the reason for this is that we're facing this climate emergency. And at current rates, we're moving towards what scientists are calling basically a catastrophic 3 degrees or more rise in temperature by the end of this century. And even if we can actually shift the direction that that everyone knows we need to do, we'd probably not do better than a 2 degrees rise, which is again called a prescription for disaster by scientists, mostly because of this zone of cascading, amplifying feedbacks that we're entering into. But here's the thing. We're all so familiar about the climate emergency, but even this climate breakdown itself is just a symptom of an even deeper underlying problem, which is basically this vast ecological destruction that our civilization is causing across the board. Just to highlight just a few points of that kind of destruction, we've seen a 69% decline in animal populations worldwide since just 1970 alone. And that's continuing at this rapid rate year by year. As a result of that and other devastation, we're now entering what scientists are calling the 6th great extinction of species since life began on Earth. The other 5 extinctions happened from exogenous events like asteroid or whatever it might have been. This one is actually caused by one species, ourselves. We're looking at the annihilation of coral reefs worldwide this century. And the UN reports that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by 2050 at the current rates. But the statistic that kind of blows my mind maybe more than any other is this one, that by 2050, at current rates, there will be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish. So it's reasonable to ask, how did we get to this devastating place in our civilization's relationship with the Earth? And in that earlier book that David mentioned, I wrote some years back, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, I looked at the ways in which we came to this, the place we are today. And in the essence of what that book kind of uncovers is this simple realization that culture shapes values, and those values shape history. And once we recognize that, by the same token, we can begin to understand that our values today are what will shape the future. And when we look at our values today, what we can recognize is that they're values based on separation. I view this this picture as iconic of that kind of separation. Everyone's separate from each other, connected with the technology, even separate from the food they're about to eat, not even thinking where it might have come from. But if we dig a little deeper in that modern story of separation, what it basically is telling us is this, that nature is a machine. The humans are separate from nature. The humans are separate from each other. That human progress arises from the conquest of nature, that the earth is a resource to exploit for human benefit. And as a result of all this, the purpose of life basically is to get wealthy and powerful. Now, this has become so widespread that it's easy to think that this is just the way it is, or this is like a sort of the global worldview or whatever. But it's a very specific worldview that emerged in one particular time and place in early modern Europe, around the time of the scientific revolution. And it was really best described in these kind of clarion calls. Francis Bacon, who is almost like the prophet of the scientific age, would put out there, which was inspiring at the time, that humans with this scientific way of thinking could establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe and render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. And that way of thinking led to this approach that Europeans took at that time to start conquering nature, basically. And while they were conquering nature, they also saw basically a destiny to then conquer other nations and other continents, which of course they did. And so if we look at that story of separation that arose around that time and in Europe around then, we can begin to look at the entailments of that and see how they affect our dominant worldview today. And the most important entailment is this kind of human supremacy and white supremacy that arose from that sense of separation. There's this sense that, well, humans are different in essence from all other animals, from the rest of nature. And not just different, but really the only source of true intrinsic value, that nothing else has value except in how they serve humans. And out of that way of thinking came this white supremacy, this sense of Europeans, and particularly white Christian male Europeans, as being just somehow essentially better and superior than other kinds of human beings. That led to it being then natural to see nature as a resource and other people as resources, and resources specifically to extract everything possible from nature and exploit other people in any way possible. That was viewed as not just morally acceptable, but almost like a moral directive. And those are the underpinnings of the system that we've all been born into today, of global capitalism. And it's that system that has led to the greatest inequality in history, where roughly like the wealthiest 26 billionaires on the earth today have as much wealth as half the entire world's population of 4 billion people. And it's led to basically the domination by these massive transnational corporations of every aspect of our world today, not just economics and finance, but also media and politics and technology, and culture. So that right now, if you look at the 100 largest economies in the world, 69 of them are not countries, but transnational corporations. And these transnational corporations are driven according to their stock price. This is what drives their values and what they do. And the stock price basically is based on perpetual growth. You're familiar with this concept of a PE ratio, price to earnings ratio. Basically, that's the multiple by which what the company is earning today is valued at as a function of how quickly they're going to grow those earnings in the future. So what we see is if we look at the core design principles of global capitalism today, we see that they are inherently unsustainable, that they're basically about maximizing shareholder returns, keeping growing at all costs, viewing material consumption basically as a proxy of welfare, and seeing non-human nature as a resource to exploit, which all leads to this extractive directive to monetize everything as fast as possible, to turn humans basically into conditioned consumers and to exploit every available resource on the earth. And ever since the Second World War, at least, this system has been incredibly successful in that directive. Well, many of you are familiar with this concept of what's called the Great Acceleration. Scientists have charted all the different ways of human usage and human impact on the earth. And we see that since that Second World War, around 1950, there's been this explosion in all these different elements of production and consumption around the world as a result of this system. And it continues. It's not like it's kind of pausing right now. So in fact, mainstream economists project that with all the destruction being caused by today's system, we're looking at a tripling of GDP by 2060. which is why many earth scientists are warning that we are rapidly heading for a precipice. Johan Rockström and his team in Stockholm developed what they call a model for a safe operating space for humanity, looking at 9 planetary boundaries. Terrifyingly, we've already broken through that safe operating space in at least 5 of those 9 boundaries. And so scientists and thousands of scientists around the world are putting out warnings to humanity, such as soon it'll be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. And we're looking at a very big risk that will end our civilization. And even UN Secretary General, the ex-Secretary General Ban Ki-moon talked about it being a global suicide pact. So let's pull back out again and look at where are we actually headed. Well, basically, if we take a big view of history, there's just been a couple of major phase transitions in the human experience since we evolved as hunter-gatherers many hundreds of thousands of years ago. About 10 to 12,000 years ago started the shift from nomadic hunter-gatherers to the rise of agriculture and agrarian civilizations. That changed everything in the human experience for those who underwent that transition. Similarly, what we were just looking at, the scientific revolution and the modern worldview, was another of these major transitions that changed just about everything in the human experience. We can be pretty sure we're undergoing a transition every bit as large as those two this century. The question is, what direction is it going to go to? And we can kind of consider there's really 3 possible scenarios. One is that scenario of collapse that so many scientists are warning about that we just saw. There's another scenario that in some ways, from a moral perspective, maybe even worse than collapse, is this kind of notion of like a techno split where the elites barricade themselves off against what would be the collapse of the vast majority of the world, and then kind of explore their sort of more highly techno, neurally, genetically enhanced civilization, almost like a speciation split, which is a little bit like a sort of gilded lifeboat of the elite saying, okay, we're not going to deal with the rest of the misery that we've caused and just do our own thing. But there's another possibility, that somewhere in between those 2 extremes, there's possibility of finding a pathway for sustainable flourishing. And that's what we're going to focus our attention on right now. And many people are calling it this possibility for an ecological civilization arising out of this transformation of our current civilization. So now we're focusing our attention on this ecological civilization. So what is an ecological civilization? Basically, we can think of it as a transformation in the very basis of our global civilization, from one that is wealth-based to one that is life-based. And we can think of it as like a global cultural and economic system promoting sustainable flourishing for humans and the earth. And we can see the foundation or the overriding objective of that civilization is to create the conditions for all humans to flourish as part of a thriving, living earth. And something important to understand is that this vision of an ecological civilization doesn't just belong to a few people somewhere coming up with this idea. It's really an emerging vision from diverse sources, from indigenous models of life-affirming values like Buen Vivir, Sumac Corse in Latin America, or Ubuntu in Africa. It's community-driven by transition towns and rights of nature movements and theory of the commons. It's spiritually driven by engaged Buddhism, for example, and deep ecology thinking. And then it's politically driven by things like the movements for justice, for LGBTQ rights, or racial justice, or anti-globalization. So it's a movement that entails millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world. But it also is a movement that has certain core principles. And that's what we're going to be exploring now as we, in the rest of this presentation, the core principles of an ecological civilization. And we can think of these core principles basically as having 3 levels, which I'm going to take us through in turn. First, the most fundamental of all is just looking at what are some of the fundamental principles of life itself. Then we're going to kind of up-level somewhat and look at what are some of the general principles of ecosystems arising from those fundamental principles. And then we're going to look at some of the specific principles of human flourishing. And once we've looked at these principles, we're going to have time to just do some glimpses of what that might actually mean, or what an ecological civilization might actually look like before I finish this presentation. But let's begin first with the fundamentals, fundamental principles of life. And to understand some of those fundamental principles, it helps to really sort of go back to was really where the modern understanding of life began, which was, it could be identified in other places, but I think that probably most people would agree, looking at the foundation of this idea from this book from the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Erwin Schrödinger. Wrote this book way back in about 1944. Now, many of you will know the name Schrödinger from physics, of course, and from that famous phrase, Schrödinger's cat, which looked at the paradox there in quantum physics. But when he turned his brilliant mind to life, and to understanding the fundamentals of life. And when he did so, not surprisingly, because of where he came from, he saw the foundation as basically being in physics. And he started with this recognition of the second law of thermodynamics, which many of us know by basically the irreversible process of entropy, which essentially the law says is that order inevitably becomes disordered in the universe. Heat always flows to colder regions. And when that is applied to the whole picture of the universe itself and when it began, it's really a pretty awful realization that it leads to, which is this sense that most physicists still agree is that likely the universe will ultimately eventually dissipate into this bleak, cold expanse of nothingness because of this law. But this is what Schrödinger discovered or realized as he thought it through, that actually what life does is it engages in a temporary reversal of entropy. And he called it negative entropy. Some people shorten that to negentropy, and some people actually nowadays call it syntropy. And what he showed is that what life does is it takes this random energy and matter floating around in the universe, and through a process of metabolism, it turns it into all the things that we know and love, including ourselves, basically. And we can think of it as a temporary reversal when we look at the entire lifespan of the universe itself. But actually here on Earth, it's been pretty much there really from the earliest days of when life first formed on the Earth, the first few 100 million years of Earth's existence, billions of years ago. And since that time, the biologists Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana gave a name to what life basically miraculously accomplished in those early days. They call it autopoiesis, which is, we can really translate that as like life's self-generation. So life generates itself. And when scientists have now studied what likely happened in those earliest days when life first formed on Earth, the notion is that there were probably these kind of protocells, these complex molecules that developed these autocatalytic reactions, meaning like they were able to catalyze their own reactions of taking energy and matter from the universe and maintaining it in a perpetuating kind of way. And as these complex molecules got more sophisticated, they underwent basically like a phase transaction, a phase transition where they became more stable, more resilient and self-generative, ultimately leading to the first living cells. And if we kind of go into what they did in that phase transition and what really defines a living cell, one of the most important elements of that is this notion of reciprocal causality, which basically means that each part of that system, whether it's a cell or any kind of organism, each part of the system affects the whole, while the system as a whole affects each part. And so it's reciprocal. It's not the one comes first, but they both create each other. And a key element to understand from that is that every part exists for the greater purpose of maintaining and regenerating the organism. And if we look at how this system works in this way, another key principle that arises from that is integration. That within any of these living systems, what we see is unity with differentiation, which basically is a way we can define integration. That each part maintains its unique identity, but it's coordinating with all the other parts of the system. And to do that, the parts have to remain in intimate feedback loops of communication with a large number of the related parts. And the way that they stay in these intimate feedback loops is using what network scientists call small world networks, like basically systems of hubs and spokes, where there's a lots of small, close interactions within a group, and then a few broader interactions with other hubs elsewhere. And scientists have seen this now basically in virtually every network in living systems: intracellular networks, neural networks, fungal networks, the Wood Wide Web of mycorrhizal networks underground in a forest, or in ecosystems. And when these networks expand from single cell to basically populate the whole of the Earth, they expanded in ways that were fractal. And fractals, as many of you are going to know, are patterns that repeat themselves at different scales, and they indicate self-organized activity. And now scientists find them everywhere in the natural world. You see them in leaves or the branches of trees and shells, the bronchioles in our lungs, or in neurons. So much so that scientists have begun to see nature itself in many ways as a fractally connected system, where the same underlying living principles that organize a cell are found in the principles that organize the organism, which the cell's part, and the same principles we see in the species. And then we expand out, and we see some similarity in principles in ecosystems, and ultimately in the entire global system of the living Earth, which some call Gaia. And it's also described as the holarchy, which is this recognition that each is a unified organism as part of something bigger and containing unified organisms within it. So the next question is, how do these fractal relationships work? And how does all this interconnectivity work? Is it like mostly competition or cooperation? And what we see in life is this vast spectrum between extremes of cooperation and competition and all kinds of blends in between. So at the extremes, we see extreme cooperation, for example, with cells in an organism, or extreme competition with a predator and prey. We also see not quite as extreme, but still strong cooperation in things like insect colonies, and not quite as extreme, but still some competitive elements going on, say, with parasites on a host. But then you also get these blends where it's almost impossible to distinguish between cooperation and competition. Dynamics like mast fruiting in this complex dynamic between trees and nuts and squirrels, where there's both competitive elements at play and cooperative elements at play. And David, as many of you are aware, has spent a big part of his life exploring how we can understand this blend of competition and cooperation. And as he explains it, what we see is, on one level, we see agents following their own adaptive strategies in this blend of competition and cooperation, just like we're just exploring in that spectrum. He calls those basically complex adaptive systems too, like CAS2 systems. But then every now and then, under special conditions, some of these CAS2 systems can undergo a phase transition. So like we saw that first phase transition of life itself to a CAS1 system, which is characterized as a system where cooperation supersedes competition. There may still be competition within that system, but cooperation is more dominant. And that leads, and if we look at the whole span of life on Earth, that has led to the evolution basically of the complexity of life on Earth. If we look back over billions of years, there's only been a few of these phase transitions from the first single cells to complex cells, to multicellular life, to social animals, and to hominids very recently. And in each of those cases, what we see is like a system-level selection arising from increases in cooperation that took place to allow those phase transitions to occur. And it's those that increasing complexity that's led to the ecosystems that we experience in the world today, which basically are like an integrated blend of those CAS1 and CAS2 systems, and integrated in this competition and cooperation, but in an integrated way. And we can sort of think of ecosystems right now as we look at them, billions of years after life evolved on Earth, as really like a resilient cascade of negative entropy, getting more and more sophisticated. And ecosystems can remain resilient for millions of years. And so now we're going to turn our attention to this next level of trying to understand what are some of those general principles that allow ecosystems to be so resilient. And we're going to go through these just really quickly, one by one. And so the first is this notion of symbiosis, where in these complex ways, where basically you see it all through an ecosystem, plants photosynthesizing, providing nourishment, insects pollinating the plants, animals transporting their seeds, fertilizing the soil, fungus regenerating the soil, and even through their mycorrhizal networks, transporting nutrients for the trees. You see this principle of holarchy that we touched on, where essentially each is part of a greater whole. And as we look at these principles, we'll just begin to touch on how they might apply to human society. So in this case, there's a sense that the sustainable health of the whole system is required for the flourishing of each part. It's a phrase that I call fractal flourishing. Then we see that ecosystems really have massive diversity, that the system's health depends on this differentiation and integration that happens, which we can kind of translate into human terms as the inherent right of each person and community to participate in cultural, political, and economic power. Then there's a principle of balance, that each part is in a dynamically stable relationship with the entire system. We can think of that as leading in human terms to like a steady state economy with equitable distribution of wealth and power. We see this principle of grassroots self-autonomy in ecosystems, quite literally in an ecosystem, where each different blade of grass is making its own decisions as to what to do as part of a larger system. In human terms, that can come to this concept of subsidiarity, of pushing decision-making down to the lowest level possible in the system. And there's this embeddedness that every agent in the system, each component is part of that larger system. And in human terms, we see that as recognizing that we're not separate from the earth, but tending Mother Earth rather than trying to control her. And then finally, there's the concept of regeneration, that because of the regeneration, ecosystems can literally be so resilient for millions of years, allowing this sustainable flourishing into the long-term future. And this was really described so well by the Iroquois Confederacy in that famous phrase, in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. So let's now turn to this, the higher level of design principles. How do these apply to human flourishing? Because humans obviously are unique. We're a particular kind of species in ecosystems. We have our own ways of finding flourishing. And the first thing to recognize, if we go back to this phase transitions evolution, that as hominids evolved, what we see in human evolution is an even greater level of increase in cooperation than we've seen before, certainly in the primate species. And what we recognize is that humans evolved to be cooperative. Basically, early hominids, millions of years ago, now on the savannah, found themselves vulnerable to predators. Those who learned to collaborate were the most successful. And over time, human identity itself expanded from self and kin to include the entire group. So that human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, is ultimately what differentiates us from other primates. As a result of that, over millions of years, we developed as modern humans what are known as moral emotions, things like shame, compassion, guilt, gratitude, or embarrassment. We feel these things deep in our gut. And as a result of those things, we don't just act morally because we think we should. We do so because it feels right. Now, in those early nomadic hunter-gatherer days, which we spent 95% of our human history, there was still the occasional alpha males who'd have some of those more sort of primate-based instincts and want to dominate the rest of the group. So there was this elaborate sort of dynamic that took place to keep them in check. And the ethologist Christopher Boehm describes it well. And we see that in things like particular social technologies like arrow exchange that nomadic hunters would use, or sort of mockery of a prized catch. And if some alpha male still gets too big for his britches, there'd be social ridicule or ostracism, ultimately leading to extreme sanctions, including, if necessary, assassination to stop somebody from getting too wild and out of control. And those principles have stayed with indigenous cultures basically around the world. We see that in Africa, in this core concept of Ubuntu, which translates basically as I am because you are. We see that here in North America, in this famous phrase from the Lakota tribe, Mitakuye Oyasin, we are all related. And they're referring not just to each other and their cousins and family, but to all the non-human relatives around them, to all of life. And we see coming from indigenous values, indigenous scholars who have studied this kind of identify what are known as the 4 R's of indigeneity, like beginning with relationship, the kinship obligation, recognizing value within relationship with all life, responsibility, an imperative to nurture and care for those relations, reciprocity, to balance what's given and taken, and redistribution, to share what one possesses in abundance. And this way of relating to each other, it really evolved as the norm for human, basically for human social organization. And that's really kind of became the default for human social organization, which we look nowadays from all this, if we kind of look historically, we call it basically sort of self-governance of the commons, basically. And many of you are very familiar with Elinor Ostrom's work, who won the Nobel Prize when she studied the core design principles for how commons are managed successfully. Because what we find is that many commons, when they are not intruded upon by other forms of organization, can, just like ecosystems, be resilient for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. So she came up with certain core design principles. And we don't have time to go into them all, but they're concepts like collective choice arrangements or graduated sanctions, similar to what I was just describing in nomadic hunter-gatherer bands. And then governance are multi-levels, which she calls polycentric governance. And as some of you are well aware, David and his group have taken those principles and basically distilled them to look at what are the core design principles for successful cooperation, coming up with basically sort of bringing those Elinor Ostrom principles up to that higher level to understand them. And those are the 8 principles that he's come up with that we won't go into in detail right now. But from the highest level, we can see these as leading to this transformation in values for an ecological civilization, and basically shifting to an emphasis on quality of life rather than material possessions. We see that as basing our political, social, and economic choices on our shared humanity, emphasizing justice and dignity for all, and building our civilization's future on the basis of symbiosis with the living earth, where the principles, where basically the flourishing of the natural world becomes a foundational principle in itself. So in the last few minutes, I'm going to just give us a glimpse of what an ecological civilization might look like in practice if we take these principles and actually apply them in whatever we might call the real world, or whatever which phrase we want to use. And the thing to recognize about an ecological civilization is it talks about change in every aspect of our civilization in these ways, not just the economy, but every single part, as we see here, technology, wealth distribution, culture, community, governance, etc. So we'll just touch on some of those before I close this presentation. Well, first, we'd be seeing this drastic reduction in global income inequality with a just transition from the fossil fuel economy, a global wealth tax, universal basic income, a property returned to the commons. We'd stop measuring how we're doing in countries from something like GDP, which simply measures the rate at which we're monetizing the natural world, and come up with alternative measures, many of which have been developed already, one such as a genuine progress indicator, factors in negatives like income inequality, pollution and crime, and factors in positives that are not seen in GDP, like things like education, household work, or volunteer work. And when we measure how we're doing as an economy as a whole, we'd use a framework similar to Kate Raworth's donut economics, with this notion of an ecological ceiling that we have to stay within. We have to bring back from that overshoot that we're in right now. And at the other level, like a social foundation, basically a floor that we don't want to go below, providing the basics for well-being, water, food, peace and justice, housing, etc., for every person in our society. So that's this notion of the donuts that we want to stay within. And a big part of this shift would be shifting towards commons as a form of organization. And we need to understand the commons as being basically any source of sustenance and well-being that has not yet been appropriated by the state or private ownership. All of the commons are nature's contributions, things like fresh water, soil, oceans, and human ancestral contributions to our current prosperity, language, cultural traditions, technical know-how, scientific knowledge. And when we recognize the commons like that, we can see that this whole infrastructure of our civilization basically is more like a commonwealth that belongs to all of us. So when somebody comes along, makes a few tweaks and creates some company like Facebook, what they're doing, in our current society, they become multi-billionaires, but actually the vast wealth that actually allowed those tweaks to happen really belong to all of us. And that's where universal basic income comes in as a way to share that commonwealth more fairly with basically everyone on the earth. Universal basic income refers to basically an unconditional monthly payment to every adult, sufficient to meet their basic needs, recognizing that that doesn't stop people from doing purposeful work, because that's actually part of human flourishing. And people have a fundamental need to feel valued by their community. And UBI programs, when they've been tried, have consistently reported reduction in all of these elements that we recognize are bad in human society, and an increase in what we all can see as good: health, performance in school, gender equality, even entrepreneurial activity. When we turn then to corporations, we'd be looking at restructuring them so that they existed for humanity rather than simply for shareholder returns. And many of you are familiar with concepts like the benefit corporations or B corporations, which companies can choose to take as a legal underpinning, so that they're legally required to consider the impact of their decisions on their workers, customers, suppliers, community, or environment. And there's a few thousand companies that have chosen that worldwide, but it's had virtually no impact on our economy as a whole, because it's been a choice which most companies choose not to make. And even if a big corporation did choose to make it, they would no longer be on a level playing field. And so they would actually lose out compared to those companies that didn't want to try to benefit others and were ready to just exploit to the max. So in an ecological civilization, we'd be looking at a triple bottom line requirement for corporate charters, fundamentally reorganizing these corporations. Maybe their charters could only be renewed, say, every 5 years at the discretion of community-based panels chosen by a process of sortition to reduce corruption. So not the revolving door process that regulators have right now with corporations. And corporations would be subject not just to financial bankruptcy, but social or environmental bankruptcy if they fail to meet that triple bottom line of not just profit, but also people and planets. We'd be moving towards a circular economy, which increases employment while reducing waste, with products designed for repair and recycling, sourcing from recycled materials with waste virtually eliminated. Our cities would be designed on ecological principles, with community gardens on every block, extensive use of things like aquaponics and rooftop gardens, cars banned from city centers, and basically essential services always within a 20-minute walk to allow for face-to-face community building. Outside of the cities, we'd be seeing agroecology replacing global industrial monocrops based on principles of permaculture and regenerative agriculture, with greater crop biodiversity, water and carbon efficiency, the virtual elimination of synthetic fertilizer, and of factory farming. And it's been shown that these processes can be as productive as industrial agriculture, but without their devastating effects. Looking at technology, we'd be moving towards enabling a global commons. Like right now, developments in technology allow for centralized control by these massive corporations over our own information, monetizing our own behavior and influencing our behavior for profit. But we'd be looking more at a decentralized form using distributed ledgers of those technologies, empowering and protecting collective action, which can enable people to coordinate and cooperate at scale in all different areas of life, such as property law, money systems, enterprise structures known as DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations, or information ownership, and democracy itself. Looking out to our culture and community as a whole, we'd be moving at the deepest level in our educational systems from the current domination systems, well defined by Riane Eisler, as authoritarian hierarchical social structures, which currently subordinate women and femininity to masculinity and the patriarchy, and idealize domination and violence in the stories, to what she describes as a partnership system, an equal valuing of males and females with mutual respect and trust, and giving high value to stories that value empathic and caring relations. In our community connection, we'd be building a planetary consciousness along with a place-based identity, with a concept that's known as cosmo-local connection. So the place-based identity would be those face-to-face interactions with citizen action networks, building trust and agency locally, and planetary consciousness. Organizations like Facebook converted to a global commons, existing for us to basically communicate, not for profit making, but to actually build a sense of cosmopolitanism, global citizenship, celebrating diversity, just like all living systems, while recognizing our deep interdependence. Over time, this could lead to a polycentric form of global governance, from the fractally spreading out from the neighborhood all the way to cities, bioregions, nations, and the globe itself, with multiple centers of semi-autonomous decision-making, each taking each other into account, with recognizing both competitive and cooperative relationships, and with ultimate resource to conflict resolution, again, on those principles of mechanisms with graduated sanctions. And at the global level, we'd be looking at basically a rights of nature declaration, putting the natural world on the same legal standing as humanity, with personhood being given to ecosystems, rivers, high-functioning mammals, and ecocide being defined as an international crime. We'd be looking at basically reducing the human footprint. And as E.O. Wilson was proposing, the Half Earth Initiative, setting aside roughly half of the planet for non-human nature, for long-term flourishing. And ultimately, as time goes on, we'd be looking at this potential for humanity to truly become what is available to us as a species, to become a connected superorganism, basically like an emergent self-organized collective intelligence, but one that sees itself not separate from the earth that we're part of, but to see ourselves and the living earth as an integrated whole. And the long-term potential has us moving basically from the Anthropocene to what evolutionary environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht calls the Symbiocene. If we know that the Anthropocene right now is characterized by this ideology of human supremacy, with human impact having these geological proportions, being destructive of life and inherently unsustainable, the potential is there for us to move to a different era of the human relationship with the earth based on this principle of symbiosis, of the mutual mutually beneficial flourishing of humans and Earth, using the technology we have for regenerative purposes. And this era could potentially be incredibly long-lived because we'd find a stable relationship with the Earth. Basically, we'd become a civilization learning how to tend Mother Earth. So this ends my presentation right now. If you want to find more about my work, as David referred to, these are the 2 books I've written in the last few years, and this is the network that we can explore collaboration with and join if you don't already know it, the Deep Transformation Network. And I'm going to stop sharing right now and go back to our group connection. And one thing I just wanted to point out right before we go into more of a group discussion here is I was focusing a lot of attention today on these core underpinnings of this ecological civilization. There's a big question that I imagine, I almost hope would be in everyone's mind is, well, okay, now we see that's there, but how do we get from where we are now to that place, assuming we really like this vision? So I'd be very happy also in our conversation for us to explore that. So feel free to raise questions around that kind of topic as we move into this next phase of this meeting. So thank you very much for that. And let me turn to you, David, to kick off this next phase.
Well, first of all, clapping, resounding claps. So very inspirational, and so much to say. I think that if we want to queue up to talk, please raise your virtual hand and that will automatically queue us up. There's so much to say, and I don't want to be the first. And so I'm not surprised that Brian McConnell is the first. And so Brian, go for it. And then let's have people raise their hands. And I think the one thing I'll say is that let's just have the conversation go wherever it will, but at some point, turn it to our communities, I think. But we have lots of time. We have 35 minutes, really spacious. So let's just see where this conversation goes. So Brian?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy. Thanks for being a network friend, Facebook friend to me too. I appreciate that. Well, kind of a long time friend. Where to start? Thinking along the lines of whole lawns and adopting a complex whole systems kind of perspective and view. So much of this then, this process of how do we make deep transformation and bring an ecological civilization into existence, where I'm kind of invited and pulled, gravitating is the level of governance, which is something that over the last few months in my work with David has come up, where his focus going back to kind of earlier in the year was on a theoretical kind of a reevaluation of economics.
Mm-hmm.
The level actually higher and beyond that is one of polity. So, and that involving kind of the rules, societal, civilizational rules relating to institutions,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and those structures. So with respect to leadership and assuming roles of leadership in this process, here in North America with the prosecution of Donald Trump with respect to, so what a mess, right? I mean, in terms of the inadequacy of traditional political systems, that what are your thoughts on in this transformational process in terms of what do we do differently, how do we begin to do it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you for that question, Brian. And yeah, I think when we're looking at the governance around us in the world right now, it's very clear, obviously, that it's fundamentally broken in many ways. I mean, basically, we need to recognize the nation state itself arose in conjunction with this global capitalism extraction process that I was describing at the beginning of this presentation. It's designed around that. And what we think of as democracy, this kind of representative democracy with elections every few years and then sort of kicking out the leaders, it's basically almost designed to bring in corruption. And it's actually not the way a true democracy could actually work. So even if it was somewhat working, we'd want to make those shifts, but we're seeing right now with this extreme polarization, with the break apart of our society, really, this terrifying way in which it is just kind of falling apart. But the way that I see it is, one implication from that is we're not likely to get the changes that we really need to come from our current political leaders. That doesn't mean we should bypass the political process. It's incredibly important to work with the political process itself and to try to at least shift it away from the most regressive elements we see happening. But at the same time, we need to recognize this kind of leadership we need towards an ecological civilization is something that has to come from within, has to come from within the society through groups of people organizing collectively and making it happen. And one way I think that we can think of it metaphorically, if you will, is a little bit like as the old system unravels, the potential is to create the new system from within it. So that as these old forms of governance become less and less relevant, basically, as they fall apart, and as younger generations stop believing in the systems of authority and governments that we have in the past believed in, what is possible is a greater transformation towards a new way of thinking than has ever happened before. And that's why, I mean, what I feel the moral imperative for any of us that are part of not like the younger generation and basically inheriting this mess, but part of the older generations, is our opportunity is to really lay the foundations. So younger people, as they're seeing what hasn't worked, they can turn to a coherent foundation for what could work. So when they're rejecting this kind of mess that they've inherited, there's something they can turn to, they can believe in and start building from. So that's what I think is so important. But of course, there's a lot more to say, but let's just bring more voices into the room. Thank you.
That's great. And so Andrew, and then Mariel, and then Gary, and then Elliot, and then me. So Andrew.
Hello, Jeremy. We've never seen each other before, but we have communicated, especially about Chinese philosophy and so on. As you may suspect, I want to ask a question about the role of language and discourse in all this. I mean, you have a wonderful vision for which I congratulate you, because I think it's a wonderful vision of a more ecological civilization. And towards the end, you talk about communication across the whole globe and so on. We also have a diversity of languages, and fortunately or unfortunately, the way one language represents the world, or the values inherent in one language, are different from the values inherent in other languages. And does this pose a problem, or it shouldn't pose a problem, because we are interested in diversity of all kinds? But is there potentially a communication problem here?
Yeah, thanks for that, Andrew. And yeah, when I look at these questions around language, and of course it extends from language to also culture and moral values. You have these core values around the world, whether it's Islam or Buddhism or Confucianism or different kinds of values. So the last thing I would see in any kind of vision of an ecological civilization is some attempt to homogenize that diversity. And that's where it's so important to go back to those fundamentals of life that we started this presentation with, that fundamental really principle of integration, being like a sort of unity with differentiation. That's where the richness of life basically arose. And that's where true health exists within a system. So when we think of language or whatever it might be, I think that's where we need to look at this potential to really celebrate those differences and to understand how differences in language, differences in cultures allow a richness. So encouraging within our core human values, that curiosity to understand that difference that's there. And along with that, to also recognize the shared principles, the shared fundamental underpinnings of language itself. If you think of George Lakoff's work and this recognition that all language basically comes from our embodied scaffolding of our human experience, and we use metaphors in ways that always come from that embodied experience. We have that shared human experience, and so through curiosity and that embrace of diversity, it allows us, I think, all humans to basically then move into a richness of experience rather than a homogenization. So those are the core principles I'd see approaching with that.
Could I just quickly come back on, my question really was, does this cause a problem in communication?
I see. Well, my sense is, I think obviously this is where technology can play such a great part with things like AI enabling us to actually in real time basically translate from one language to another. It again enables that kind of beautiful sense of a planetary consciousness that can arise. At the same time, it's important for us not to let that become a force for homogenization. Every positive technological development like that has this way of also kind of dumbing down, if you will, the richness of complexity. So I think that's another area that we have to be aware of. But I think that's the potential too.
Okay,
So thank you for that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Mariel.
Hello. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, Mariel.
I wanted to ask if you're familiar or have you written about the history of the word ecology and addressed the contradiction using the word ecology in this context and sense?
Oh, do you want to say more about, well, I've often think of it in terms of ecology related, how it relates to economy, but please say more about the contradiction in the word ecology itself.
The root word oikos arose in Greece and Athens around the 4th or 5th century BC and referred to what was considered the basic organizing unit of their social system, which was the family, and it could also variously refer to the household, the farm, and all the slaves that family held. And this was actually where the European version of democracy was first developed.
Right.
Then in the 19th century in Germany, Ernst Haeckel developed the word ecology using the word oikos, and he professed himself as the word now is scientific racist and eugenicist. He believed that once the scientific method was applied, it would show that certain Europeans were better suited to live than other organisms and humans, and many groups of humans were doomed to extinction due to their maladaptations. This has been refuted by the empirical process, but this is what he believed, and this was the underpinnings of regimes such as Nazism, racism in the United States, and apartheid.
I got you.
And
eugenicist policy. I understand, and thank you for that. I think you raise a very, very important point. The important point basically is that if you just want to look at these kind of fundamentals of life and apply them to human society without going to those other levels that we just looked at in terms of what David has explored, those kind of principles for full human cooperation, you can move into this place of basically eco-fascism. And it's I completely agree with you that when we let you look at the beginning of the 20th century, things like Nazism and other forms of fascism came about from this return to nature kind of thinking. Henkel, a perfect example, people like D.H. Lawrence, these kind of beautiful romantic images of connecting with indigeneity and earth. And they also led to these fascistic ways of thinking. We see that happening again right now with the rise of eco-fascism. It's something that Amitav Ghosh talked about really well in his book, The Nutmeg's Curse, that I recommend to people to read on this topic. But thank you for raising that. I think what's important to recognize is that's where we can't just feel that beginning with ecological principles automatically leads us to a place of what I think of as an ecological civilization, that human flourishing. We have to recognize that there is a moral dimension arising from these, what I see as core human values, that leads away from that kind of fascistic thinking. And I do think that ultimately it's a diversion of thinking that arises from applying some of those hierarchical models of the domination society and subverting basically the understanding of some of those principles of what human flourishing is about. But it's a very important point that you make that we need to be very aware of in any, especially as things unravel and you see more and more people attracted towards a very pathological kind of ecological thinking like that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will say that I think that there's a conflation of, I mean, I think it's good to be clear about our beliefs and what we've observed and used with the scientific method. Like, it does produce excellent observations and sometimes predictive systems. And scientific racism was a way to try, I mean, science, to try and legitimize people's beliefs in that way. And I know it's hard to keep these separate, but that's really, I think it's good to be explicit between our beliefs and what we have good data on. Yeah. But we do have good data on the unraveling, so.
Yeah, so I want to, these are priceless comments. I also want to accommodate others and then to transition to a discussion of our community. So Gary and Elliot, and then let's proceed as briskly as we can, and I'll be brisk myself.
Sure, thanks. Hi. Yeah, kind of trying to address or musing on enacting healthful becoming. My professional life has been a director, actor, and producer of live theater, not film and TV. And so I tend to look at that as the lens through which I interpret things. So the wonderful vision that Jeremy laid out for me is a play. How do we bring the life into the play? If you think about doing a piece of theater, a bunch of volunteers come together to form a temporary community to live under an as yet unknown social reality and series of relationships. And through the rehearsal process, you mount a play and then you produce it and you share it, and it becomes an experience. So I look at the theater, the process of theater, at least from my approach, as kind of a fractal of growing culture. So just sharing that it's I don't want to go on too much longer. Richard Rohr has an interesting quote. He says, "We don't think our ways into a new way of living, we live our way into a new way of thinking." And I think that's what theater can offer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Gary. And that reminds me so much of that quote from Otto Scharmer that I really love and get inspired by, which is basically so that we can live into that emerging future. That it's not a matter of just looking at how did this thing happen and it's so far away and how are we going to change our government. It's actually each day we have the choice to live our lives as if we are living in an ecological civilization, live our lives with each other according to those values. And that in itself can be so powerful because the actual transmission of our lived experience to others is more powerful than any words we might transmit to tell them they should be a certain way. So thank you for bringing that into the space.
Okay, so Elliot, are you next?
I think you're muted, Elliot. We're not hearing you.
I pressed my mute. I guess you had unmuted me. Okay. I just wanted to bring, I guess I would say, a challenge to everybody on the call to be actively engage in your own what we call a hyper local community, and to bring to that not just the spirits of cooperation and all of the principles that we have articulated during this call, but another key principle of tolerance. And that when I say tolerance, I don't mean a kind of a kind of patronizing kind of acceptance, but more like a drought tolerance or a heat tolerance, because as a hyper local community activist around these principles, I feel the real transforming process is to actually be able to enter into a space with, at least initially, feelings and energies that you might find difficult to absorb and be in relationship to. And there's actually an alchemy that you can learn and can be trained in, and how to actually facilitate that kind of collective discovery. A lot of which is rooted in the hyper-local realities. I'm in Northern California in a very fire-affected community, and it's a politically diverse community, but we have all agreed that we don't want to burn down again. And so that has become kind of a fundamental principle by which we can begin to engage each other across all the other kind of what will be hopefully obsolete kind of categories of relationship, and to begin to create new forms of relationship. So I would just seeing 139 or so kind of dedicated, eco-civilizationalists here, I would encourage everybody to look for those places. I mean, there are all kinds of schools of training, such as asset-based community development, process work psychology are two that I find particularly useful in my work here. But I would just like to leave that with everybody as well. Thanks.
Yeah. And of course, the pro-social work that David's organization offers is fundamental to that learning.
That's right. That's right.
Well, on that note, I would like to frame this a little bit in terms of dual inheritance theory. And what that means is that there's actually two streams of inheritance in our species, not just one. There's the genetic stream that all species have, and then there's the cultural stream, in which our meaning systems, what we've been talking about, are literally the cultural equivalent of our genes. And I think that there's tremendous metaphorical transfer in thinking of our meaning systems as like our genes, that adds value basically to the other ways that we be thinking about meaning systems all along. And when you think that, that every genotype, to think of it from genetic evolution, leads not to leads to basically a repertoire of behaviors. That's called phenotypic plasticity, basically. Every organism has some degree of flexibility in responding to its environments, and that flexibility is due to the single set of genes that it has. But that repertoire is limited. And so if you want to go beyond that repertoire, you need to actually change the genotype. And then just take all of that and metaphorically transfer it over to our meaning systems. What it reveals is, in the certain part, however you're thinking, whatever's inside your head, provides you with a repertoire of behaviors. But to go beyond that, you need to change what we call your symbotype, your meaning system. And so what it does is it reveals the necessity for inner work in order to accomplish outer work. And it's on this basis that we can begin to rethink therapy, for example, and training. It's on this basis that the best mindfulness-based techniques, such as acceptance commitment training and therapy, along with the engaged Buddhism form of mindfulness, appears in a new light. And so I think that this is part of what comes from reframing this, or I should say, being more explicit about it from a multi-level cultural evolutionary perspective. So, and that was more a comment than a question, although please respond, Jeremy. And then I'd like just to encourage us all to turn, if we want, to a discussion of our communities, what we're trying to do as these two communities in different ways. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you, David. And yeah, I think that what you're saying, what it points to is this recognition that this trend, this shift towards an ecological civilization, is this multi-dimensional shift, and it involves transformation for each of us at different layers. And every one of us has actually inherited from this dominant culture some of those conditionings that are difficult. And I think a lot of each of us has our own inner work to do to actually recognize those and to work with them with kindness, but to use that approach to really kind of to shift ourselves, to connect more with community. And that involves transformation at the community level and transformation at the global level. And we have to recognize that each of those levels require the transformation at the other two. So we have to always be thinking this kind of multidimensional way, which leads to this very notion of community, because so many people who are part in this group here today come, either from the deep transformation community or the pro-social community. And what we want is exactly to be doing almost like that shift from that CAS 2 to CAS 1 kind of shift. We recognize we've got our own communities. We want to start working together to actually start to be part of a much broader and transformational change, leading towards that kind of phased transition to that potential of an ecological civilization. So this is the key question. Many of us are working on our stuff, but we're all asking, how can we amplify this work? So I think it's a great topic for us to really try to spend a few minutes on and be open to ideas people have. I mean, one obvious example is what we're doing right now, and I'd love to invite you, David, to have an interactive conversation as we have on the Deep Transformation Network, where if we talked today a lot about the way my own particular path of analysis, love to then look at your core principles and really talk about that and let other people on the DTN understand that at a deeper layer. But then we can also make those bonds even tighter. So let's hear what other people have to think.
I mean, please let this be the beginning of a bridge between the two communities. And so we have Jesse and Susan and Joseph and Barbara, and we have 10 minutes.
Well, I'll try not to take all of it. Easily could, though. I've studied this subject as deeply as Jeremy, for sure, except from a different angle. I'm a physicist who turned designer to study the designs of nature because physics was leaving things out. And the main thing it leaves out is the connections. And as talk about the beginning and the end, and we don't talk about nature's great conveyor belt of design from one state to another, which we call growth, which can be either a highly creative process or a highly destructive one. It's growth is what produces explosions, and growth is what produces life. And there's a neat transition that must occur for life to be as a result, and that's for growth to end and give its resources to the needs of the thing that grew. Mm-hmm. So we have a world that is starving for the resources that are being hogged by growth, mm-hmm. that are disrupting everything on the planet. But the system can't change by incremental adjustments. It's got mm-hmm. to change as a whole. So somehow the people who are managing the crisis, who mostly are really good moms and dads who go home and think holistically in the family, go to work and think exploitively in business. And so business follows rules that neglect the context. When you go home, you're immersed in the context and you live differently. So these are slippery changes that can mm-hmm. happen very quickly from one conversation to the next, where you change the kind of world you think you live in. Yeah. But anyway, I put my links in the chat. I have a lot of good short stories and a lot of good ideas about how we could stimulate the whole system to change as a whole, since that's the only way it's going to happen. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, Jesse. Yeah, great perspective to add to that. Thank you.
Yeah, and this is great. I mean, there's so much here to say. So thanks everyone for their brevity. there's so much more to be said about each and every one. Susan.
Hey guys, hey Jeremy, thank you so much. I always enjoy your presentations, and I love the vision. Gosh, I'm almost overwhelmed because I was interested by what Jesse had to say. What I was thinking, well, you were asking what we're doing, and I'm going to be presenting to a local community club soon, and so when I see your presentations, I always want to pretty much steal them and then adapt them. And I'm kind of doing that anyway, my own variation of that. One of the questions that arose, and maybe it's rhetorical in nature because I don't know that there's a specific answer. As you're presenting this vision, which I think a lot of us really resonate with, is, and there's a lot of questions around that, obviously, but one is, how do we implement certain aspects of this vision when we know we're going to be increasingly fighting the impacts of the feedback loops that we're facing? And people have referenced, like, it's going to shrink the economy, and so much of our energy is going to be invested in, trying to muster the personal resilience and then the collective resilience to address crises after crises of varying nature and degrees. And so I do think getting the message, sharing this message in whatever form we can is vital. And I think each of us has a way to do that, and that will begin to shift the conversation, but the conversation will be changed dramatically just by the impacts of what we're going to be facing and what we are facing. So
Yes.
maybe, as I say, that's rhetorical, but that's kind of the thought I was having, is like, this sounds great. How are we going to do this?
Exactly. Yeah. No, I totally hear what you're saying, Susan. And just a couple of thoughts came to my mind that I'll try to say quickly. One is as almost like a metaphor of, we can think of each of us like a sort of islands of coherence in this kind of chaotic sea that we're experiencing right now. It's what's so important is to actually be explicit about these connections. That's why meetings like this can be so important, because each of us in our own communities might feel quite isolated in trying to put these ideas out. And then it so helps to see that we're part of this global community. So those islands can almost like raise up, become like an archipelago, and almost become a kind of a continental shift, if you will, as we connect with each other. And the other point is that as things get bleaker, it becomes even more important to maintain our vision on this light of what's possible. Just this notion that the darker it gets, and it's certainly getting dark in many ways right now, and will get darker, it gets even more important to maintain that vision of what's possible. And through connecting with others, it helps to keep that light going. So just wanted to add those points, but no, thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, Joseph. We might get just through our next three, Barbara and Stefano. So
okay, I'm a believer. Here's your two books, Jeremy. And I'm a member of Deep Transformation Network. All right, I'll be quick. I want to hear something I consider to be kind of truthful. This is from David's book about a picture of sociopathic chickens, okay? Vis-a-vis cooperative chickens, all right? When I look at your presentation, I'm in a world where the leaders are sociopathic. And I've dealt with them enough to know that they will slam you, silence you, whatever, frequently with impunity. So my point is, I'm also kind of the skeptic. Count the cost. Good people are going to suffer to make any kind of positive change. I just think that's a moral law of the universe. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Jeremy.
So, Jeremy, do you want to respond before we go to Barbara?
Well, I think it's actually a really hugely important point. We have to recognize that those people that have their grip on power right now are not going to let go of that power easily. They're not suddenly going to get enlightened and say, oh yeah, I just need a few billion less. And that's just not the way it's going to work, which is why what we need basically is people power, which we need to connect with each other. And the movement towards an ecological civilization has I think, a secret weapon, like a secret power. It's more powerful than all the weapons, than the economies, everything else, which is the human heart. Every person who's born in this world is born with that evolved desire for connection, for communication, for those 4 R's of indigeneity we talked about. And the dominant psychopathic culture has to condition that out of people. But what we have going for us is to just invite people to reconnect with that love for each other, with that love for themselves and for life that is inherent in everyone, no matter how many layers there seem to be. That, I think, is the key to this potential for that transformation.
That's right. Barbara.
Thank you for laying on this presentation. Very, very helpful, Jeremy. I hope lots of people are being inspired. I just wanted to say in the UK, there's a lot going on. And I've met up with this American, I'm an IPAT degrowth activist, and I've got an American lawyer that I'm working with now. And we've worked out that we can prove that GDP growth is in fact illegal in the face of the latest addition to our human rights, which says that we are entitled to a healthy environment. And the way that we play the stock market is ecologically damaging because of the drivers that are identified in the IPAT equation. So it's a very simple case, and I'm hoping to make it, very public. So I'll hand over to Stefano now.
Okay.
Thank you for all you're doing, Barbara. It's great work. It's inspiring.
Stefano.
Hi guys, yeah, I'll reiterate all the same thanks and affirmations. I really enjoyed the presentation and the discussion. In terms of living one's values, the thing that's really sitting with me at the moment is that I'm very concerned that with the emphasis on an effort to amplify the realization of these principles and the values and so on, that perhaps not enough emphasis is being placed generally, this is my feeling, on just the very basics of us doing it for ourselves, growing food, finding clean air and clean water, and just being with a group of people, and just, so just to be a little bit provocative, how many of us are growing 100% of our own food in our backyard or doing it with community? And I'm certainly finding it difficult to move away from the 9 to 5 to do that myself, and I'm taking steps, but it's just, I think I'm seeing a lot of people trying to share it and a lot less of just the very fundamentals, and I feel very concerned about that. I'd like to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that is so true. I think what we realize when we try to live our lives according to ecological principles is how embedded each of us is in this system, whether we like it or not. Every article we use is part of globalization, part of mineral extraction, every other aspect to it. And so I think what we need to do is also approach a certain kindness to ourselves with that, recognizing that we are embedded in these systems, and there's not, we can't just simply, in fact, if we wanted to get out of it entirely and go off grid and live our lives out in the rural area and really be totally self-sufficient, in a way we're just bypassing. We're taking all that energy and not actually engaging in trying to change the system too. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that. I respect people who do that, but there's a way in which we need to be engaged in that structural change. And if it involves being part of the system that is also exploiting and extracting, we need to be aware of that, but also know that the structural change is what has to happen. A lot of the fossil fuel companies themselves actually, have pursued this advertising strategy to get people to, say, to put the blame on themselves, like, oh, be more conscious of what you're doing, because they know that way they can move the attention away from the structural changes that threaten them. So we have to be aware of all those levels at the same time, and also live our lives in that Otto Scharmer way, like live into that emerging future in every way we can, make the shifts that are doable for ourselves, I think. Thank you.
I want to honor our time. So with apologies to Carla, okay, Carla and Julia, you got to keep it quick.
I'll keep it quick. This is as Jeremy knows, I write a lot about the shame sham. and the ways that individuals are blamed. But at the same time, when we do not work simultaneously with our individual behavior, I live in a converted school bus, totally off grid. Everything is in a state of reclamation, repurposing. And if we continue to blame corporations without simultaneously holding ourselves accountable, then we are simply replacing one hegemony with another. We are not taking the action that quantum physics is teaching us, that the second law of thermodynamics is teaching us. And when we are not acknowledging that when we buy any new products, we are absolutely folding into the system of oppressions, the interlocking systems of oppressions that we claim to be fighting against. So I so encourage us, none of us, to purchase anything new, for example, and to be constant in a constant state of vigilance, and let the state of vigilance not be one of self-incrimination and guilt and shame, but one of curiosity, one of a sense of joy and opportunity for us to be in community, in multiple kinds of communities, and collaboration. So thank you, Jeremy and David. I'm very pleased.
Thank you, Julia, and then I'll say 10 seconds, and we'll be done. Julia.
I'll be very quick, because I can just sort of thank you for the presentation, but also what Cara said, I can just sort of fully underline. I just wanted to add to, it's not just us embedded in the system is embedded in us. And I think it's so important to do the inner work, but also then to transform it into something really practical. Like Cara just said, don't buy that product. Reflect, view, what can I do without, and then go back. And I think we have to do that simultaneously. So that's me. That's all. Thank you all.
Okay, there's so much passion here. There's so much energy, and now we have to channel it, don't we? Otherwise, there's just a big burst and it subsides. And so channeling it is what our communities are about. And I think that Jeremy and I will speak to you through the email list that you registered, and then continuous engagement is what's called for here, friends. And so we'll be working towards that. But this was a wonderful time, very catalytic, I think. And let's see what we can do with it moving forward. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for being part of this.